So, when Lane was talking yesterday about conceptualization, we're still struggling to conceptualize what we do and what we are about. And, can youth work deliver was late. What you got to do is, get our ducks lined up in a row and have some kind of common understanding. We've tried to do that in Europe, and I'll come to that in a bit. Don't worry about this. I'm not going to talk about any of this or a little bit of it. But this is my one slide that I normally use, which on the left is the history of youth policy development in Europe over the last 20 years. And on the right is the history of youth work development and how they sort of dovetail and relate to each other. Next one, please. Actually, you've jumped one, haven't you? You go back one. This one, and this is important because many of you are dyed-in-the-wool youth work people. Youth work's written on my heart. I ran a youth centre for 30 years in Birmingham, England. I've been involved in youth policy for 40 years, youth work for 50 years, youth research for 40 years. I've written a lot about youth work, but I haven't just done stuff about youth work. I've done stuff about youth employment, youth justice, addictions, substance misuse, in terms of policy and practice. And youth work generally, until relatively recently, had a pretty bad press. There was a lot of skepticism about, can youth work deliver? And that's why I put that up, because my youth work stuff is the green stuff in the top left-hand corner, but there's all these other bits that I've done where youth work was either invisible or not very valued. And I think COVID has actually changed that dramatically. And I hear from the police, I hear from psychologists, I hear from schools and other groups about how youth work stepped up to the plate during COVID and made links with young people and supported them and needs to continue to support them. So we have an opportunity. And I think in Europe, we've tried to seize that opportunity. We may not be doing it terribly well, but we are trying. Keep going. Next one. Next one. I'm not going to talk about these. These will all be very familiar ideas for you. But it's really, somebody was saying, I think Lane was saying, we've got to sort of move on. We've got to deal with changing times for young people. Yes and no. There are certainly some, what I call cherished values of youth work that we have to hang on to. And we should still be advocating them irrespective of the wider social context of young people. And there are some things that we may have to think about sacrificing and adapting to, given those, Elena's stuff about Ukraine. I'll mention that in a moment. Keep going. I've got to race through these. This was for Robin, but she's not here. Yeah, there are two Europes. And the Council of Europe started in 1949 when the UK was a founding member of the Council of Europe to bring peace to the continent of Europe. And the European Union started slightly later and is still considerably smaller than the member states of the Council of Europe. So when we are talking about Europe, we're sometimes talking about the European Union with 27, used to be 28. And we're talking about the Council of Europe, which is now 46 member states, which used to be 48. But Belarus and the Russian Federation withdrew on March the 17th last year. Keep going. One of the things, Miriam knows all about this, but over 20 years, I coordinated reviews of youth policy in 21 European countries, very different European countries. And we looked, in each of those reviews, we looked at where youth work sat. And usually youth work was fairly unprominent. What was clear was that some countries were hugely dependent on EU resources. Go to Romania. Romania's got quite a good youth work story, but it's completely dependent on the work of the national agency in securing Erasmus Plus funding. Other countries, Armenia is fairly similar to Romania. Other countries such as Greece have very, very patchy youth work stories. And then, of course, countries like Finland, like Belgium, like Flemish Belgium, have long-standing histories of youth work, rather similar to the United Kingdom. So we have to remember it's a very, very patchy, mixed story. Keep going. I did this when I was asked to speak at this conference. It wasn't meant to be talked to, but I was trying to look at the sort of UK traditions on the left and the European traditions on the right, and some of those buzzy words that have cropped up over time. And the problem with a lot of these buzzy words is that people start to use them and nobody really knows what they mean because they come to mean many, many different things. And somebody once said about the word citizenship that it had been invested with so much meaningless, it had more or less become, it had been invested with so much meaning that it had more or less become meaningless. And that applies to some of these other words, you know, participation. What are we talking about? And when you enter a debate with 46 countries, the use of that language in the English language, where most people are not even speaking in their first tongue, is often very, very differently meant. Just to give you an example, street kids in Finland are the kids who skive off school and go home in the evening. Street kids in Romania are the ones who sleep above hot water vents to heat the city in Bucharest. Street kids in Honduras are the ones who get shot by the police. So just that concept of street kids means something very, very different. And we have to engage with that sort of misunderstanding as well as trying to develop a sense of understanding. I'm just going to, in a minute, I'm just going to talk about this stuff down the bottom. Keep going. And I'm going to give you some numbers, and I can't do much more than that in the time. 7 books. In 2008, youth work started to be talked about in Europe, but we thought, what are they talking about? So we held a couple of small seminars in Blankenberge in Belgium, a 3rd one in Brussels, a 4th one in Estonia, a 5th one in Malta, a 6th one in Slovenia. Oh no, we did one in, it doesn't really matter. But we talked about youth work in different kinds of ways in those 7 volumes. Oh, and the final one was about the transnational youth organizations. What had led youth work organizations to grow beyond the countries where they had started? And then we finished with what I call 12 trilemmas of youth work, the triangles within which youth work has to navigate if it's going to retain credibility, coherence, and impact on young people's lives. And then we produced this book, which is a big fat book called Thinking Seriously About Youth Work. And this came out of the 3rd European Youth Work Conference in Brussels in 2015. Keep going. We've had 3 European Youth Work conventions. I used the word convention because it sounded bigger than a conference. That was the only reason, but we had some very grand events in Ghent, then in Brussels, and then a virtual one in Bonn in Germany. And the important thing, we brought 500 youth workers together in Ghent in 2010. And people spoke from the heart. This is the yellow brick road sort of analogy. Scarecrow spoke from the heart about the diversity of youth work. We celebrated diversity, which is wonderful. We would do that in this room. But as soon as we step out of this room, we've got to find some common ground, a common message, if we are going to be united in the kind of advocacy for youth work. And that's 2015, the head. We had a financial crisis in 2012, and we started to talk about we need another conference to find common ground between self-governed youth organizations and street-based youth work, center-based youth work, project-based youth work, all kinds of different forms of youth work. Did we share something or did we not? And the common ground we found, and this word has come up a lot in yesterday and will come up again today, is spaces. Spaces and bridges was the common ground that all youth work practice seemed to be working on. A simple core message: winning spaces for young people's voice and autonomy, building bridges to the next steps in their lives. And if we make that argument with politicians, we've got a chance. If we start talking about all the fancy language that we tend to talk about and write about, we'll lose those politicians very, very quickly. So we have to think about how we advocate politically for youth work. And the 3rd one was time to act. Another term that's been used at this event, the courage to actually put into practice that we have. Keep going. So we have 3 in Europe. We have, and this is sort of EU and Council of Europe. There's, as I say, they're different constellations of countries. But in 2010, I spoke to the European Council of Youth Ministers in Brussels on behalf of the Belgian presidency, and we established a resolution on youth work. You won't like it. The EU defined youth workers at the time as socio-educational instructors. What a dreadful term that is, but it was better than nothing. And then in 2015, the convention was under the banner of the Council of Europe, still in Brussels, because Belgium had the chairmanship of the Council of Europe. In 2017, the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers produced a recommendation on youth work, which is a very good document that's well worth looking at now. And then in December, early December 2020, under the German presidency of the European Union and simultaneously the chairmanship of the Council of Europe, it was a political tactic to try to have the third convention when these two moons collided, to get that kind of dual institutional support for youth work. We have the resolution on the European Youth Work Agenda. Keep going. So over 20 years, we see the slow recognition, the slow evolution of a youth work agenda within the broader context of youth policy across the 46 countries of the of Europe. 2001, then 2008, we had the Agenda 2020, which was launched in Kiev, actually, in Ukraine. 2009, EU Youth Strategy. 2018, another EU strategy, and on Friday I'm going to be interviewed about that by some people doing research, midterm evaluation of the EU Youth Strategy. Not quite sure what I'm going to say about that. But youth work is absolutely central to one of its three pillars: engage, connect, empower. And empower has youth work right at the heart of its activity. And as Miriam well knows, because she was chairing the CDEJ, the European Steering Group on Youth, when we were doing this, we have the Council of Europe Youth Sector Strategy 2030, which has 4 thematic priorities about revitalizing democracy and rights and living together in peaceful societies. But the 4th thematic priority is youth work. Very explicitly youth work. Keep going. I'm running out of time. This is something called Signposts for the Future. This was the 3rd convention that followed rather than preceded the political declaration in 2020. And these are the 8 planks for a framework for youth work development across Europe. I haven't got time to go into them, but you can sort of interpret those in terms of a good offer. Lee talked right at the beginning yesterday about if you've got quality youth workers, well-trained, delivering quality youth work, you're likely to have quality outcomes. And that is true. And one of our problems, and we're not very honest about this, is that we often don't always have, and we have very well-intentioned youth work, but it's not necessarily the best quality of youth work intervention. And therefore, sometimes it does not produce the kind of outcomes that we would hope would come from better quality youth work. So training is considered important, not just for paid youth work, but for all youth work. Because most youth work is still unpaid and voluntary, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have to be professional, and it can be. And then, you know, a shared direction, working together with other groups, health, housing, justice, that's been mentioned. This is likely to produce greater recognition. Yes, there are lots of challenges in Europe at the moment, and we're doing work on that at the moment, and so on. Next one. Here are the challenges for Europe. I'm writing a paper for Belgium's next EU presidency next year, January to June next year. Health comes at the end. I don't know why it's not justified properly there, but that's not because it's unimportant. Post-COVID is critical, but young people generally are not the recipients of bad health. So they tend to see, if you look at surveys of young people, some of those other issues tend to become more prominent. Climate more so than democracy, in fact, in a lot of surveys. But those are the 10 sort of areas of change. Security is quite interesting because I've helped to write a reconstruction plan for Ukraine, this document, and the top item in this reconstruction plan for young people in Ukraine is security. And the top item within security is to, after the war is over, that every young person in Ukraine will be trained to carry a gun. Would we ever have thought that a youth strategy would have that as its #1 item before last year. I don't think so. And then it talks about mental health and some of the other things we're more familiar with. It also wants all young people in Ukraine to become first responders. So the Red Cross and sort of first aid stuff will become very prominent in Ukraine's future youth strategy. Carry on, I don't have time. I just wanted to mention this because Miriam mentioned it. Reykjavik had a heads of state and government meeting in Iceland called the Reykjavik Summit. And it did produce, Miriam mentioned it, a document called United Around Our Values. And on June the 6th, a high-level meeting was held online from Strasbourg about how do you put that into action. But you can see young people are absolutely central to the Council of Europe's future agenda. I'm not going to talk about those things, but I will say something briefly about reach, because one of our big problems is who are we reaching when we talk about youth work practice and indeed youth policy practice, because we tend to reach what I call the least disengaged of the most disengaged. And the most disengaged often are still left on the margins and actually even more disengaged than they were before because the distance is greater. So we've got to strengthen our reach to the young people who will benefit most from our kind of support and our kinds of interventions. Keep going. And this, Miriam's seen this before when we had a meeting in Brussels in March, but I'm writing something, I've written 62,000 words, which is a 50-year history of the evolution of youth work in Europe. And we're hoping to move forward with a sort of framework for youth work in Europe in the future, relating to those 10 big challenges. Play, reasserting itself, la vie associative, as it's known in French. Associative life, association, as the Thompson report in England talked about. Participation is very familiar to all of you, tends to almost have the guiding hand for a lot of youth work because of the UN Convention and Article 12 and so on, but it's not the only show in town. And there are other things. Then we need to get better at working on partnerships which are not selling our souls to the devil, but genuinely working closely with other agencies in the interests of young people. Then the whole thing about evidence, about proof. And we know about those debates where you need to combine the stuff that John Ord did with his 5 Nations study in Europe, but also some of the heavier stuff that I'm doing with PricewaterhouseCoopers and Ernst & Young and some of those hard-headed accountants about social returns on investment. And then proficiency, about the competence of youth workers to deliver in their communities. Keep going, nearly there. In 2010, an Estonian guy called Ardo Rotler said he thought youth work was like a dog looking for a home. And the very first thing I ever downloaded from the internet were images of dogs. And I put a Rottweiler up at that point and said, is this the only dog available? Because in 2010, at the conclusion of the first European Youth Work Convention, I pointed out that dogs can play many different roles in people's lives. A friend, a guide, a retriever, a sort of advocate, a companion. And I was trying to point out that youth workers could play lots of different roles as a dog. But Ardo's point was it just scratches around looking for food, whoever will feed it, and will do their bidding, whether that's justice or whether that's school inclusion or whatever. And mentioning John just now, he's a leading light on process, and he's absolutely right. And one of our problems is that youth work is always trying to balance different kinds of agendas from politicians, from young people, from other quarters. And if we get the balance wrong, we've lost our way, and we've actually lost our soul. So we have to think very carefully about how we maintain the balance appropriately. And I am, as somebody who did run a youth centre, an open youth centre for many, many years, I still believe that if you don't develop the relationships and build the trust, you haven't got a cat in hell's chance of doing anything else. So relationships and trust are absolutely the heart of this. Keep going, nearly there. And this is the last slide Philip Cousset, my co-writer on the 7 volumes of co-editor of the history, we were giving a lecture in Antwerp once, and Philip said, "You don't grow grass by pulling it." And I realized this is not an English phrase, this is a Flemish phrase. But I suddenly thought it's quite a nice image about pulling grass. And, you know, to develop that, youth workers are gardeners, not mechanics. They're not there to fix young people, they're to cultivate the best in young people, to give young people a sense of direction, a path, hope, that key word that came up yesterday a lot. Cultivating the personal development of young people. Non-formal education is somewhere between schools, the formal learning in schools, and the informal learning in communities. It's a big space that youth workers can capitalize on to work with young people. And we need to think more carefully about that, because sometimes we are more like teachers, whether we like it or not. And sometimes we are facilitators of community-based learning. So we have to think across that piece. And then finally, and it's a phrase that some of you will definitely be familiar with, education and learning isn't about filling of vessels, it's about lighting of flames. And what we've tried to do across a very disparate Europe, through that professional coming together and through the political declarations that we've managed to secure, we've tried to get all countries, all 46 countries of Europe, lighting flames for young people. We're not by any means there yet, but we've got a damn sight closer in the last 20 years. It takes time. Thank you.
Thank you.